In the midst of a business dinner, Edward Hale found himself interrupted by a small voice. "Pardon me, good sir." He glanced down to see a small girl with sparkling blue eyes gazing up at him. She paused for a moment, then raised her wrist, exposing a birthmark that mirrored his perfectly. "My mother once shared with me that if I ever came across someone like this," she softly said, "he could be my father." The surroundings dissolved into nothingness. His history had just caught up with him, and it bore his gaze. Edward Hale occupied a table in one of the city's priciest dining establishments, a venue renowned for its assurance of privacy and flawless service. The evening unfolded as expected, a familiar business dinner, a deal in progress, another night where everything aligned perfectly. He seemed somewhat disengaged from the discussion happening at his table. While his business partners engaged in discussions about market expansions and potential acquisitions, Edward's thoughts drifted to other realms. He had constructed his domain with meticulous planning and unwavering focus, yet recently, an inexplicable void had started to creep into his consciousness. He brushed it off as mere fatigue, swirling the wine in his glass with a contemplative air. He exhaled slowly, his piercing blue eyes sweeping across the softly illuminated restaurant. The gathering was brimming with the city's most distinguished individuals, including politicians, celebrities, and executives akin to him. All aspects of this location felt known, routine, until a soft voice pierced the gentle murmur of chatter. "Pardon me, good sir." Edward glanced over, taken aback. A small girl, perhaps no older than 8, stood next to his table. Her long, wavy blonde hair cascaded around her delicate features, while her strikingly bright blue eyes held an uncanny familiarity. She grasped a napkin in her delicate hands, twisting it anxiously. Edward scowled. It was common for affluent families to take their children to upscale dining establishments, yet there was something distinctly unique about this girl. She was alone. He looked around, anticipating the arrival of a hurried parent, yet no one appeared. "Do you find yourself wandering aimlessly?" he inquired, his tone steady yet tinged with intrigue. She paused, a moment of uncertainty flickering across her face before she finally shook her head. "No." "What is the location of your parents?" She paused once more, then gradually reached out her delicate hand toward him. And that was the moment he noticed it, a birthmark, not merely any birthmark, but his very own. The identical form, positioned precisely on her wrist just like the one on his arm. His breath hitched in his throat. The restaurant receded into the periphery. The murmurs surrounding him became indistinct. The young girl's azure gaze met his, probing, anticipating. Then she spoke once more, her voice gentle yet resolute. "My mother mentioned that if I ever encounter someone who shares my birthmark, I should let him know." Edward's grip on the wine glass grew firmer, his heart racing within him. "What should I say to him?" he inquired, his tone now more subdued. She took a breath, then softly uttered the words that broke his reality. "It's possible that you could be my father." Edward fixed his gaze on the girl, his fingers clenching the stem of his wine glass with increasing intensity. His thoughts wrestled with the weight of what he had just encountered. The words seemed otherworldly, beyond belief. Is that his daughter? Couldn't possibly be right. He examined her features, looking for a hint of recognition beyond the birthmark. Her golden locks, her striking blue eyes. There was an unmistakable quality about them, a likeness he found impossible to overlook. The restaurant surrounding him blurred into a mere echo. The men at his table fell into a hush, sensing an oddity in the air, yet Edward remained oblivious to their presence. All his attention was directed at the young girl before him, eagerly anticipating his reply. "Could you repeat that?" he inquired, his tone subdued, exhibiting greater restraint. The girl paused, her weight shifting from one foot to the other. She looked at the napkin in her hands, as if summoning her resolve. "My mother mentioned that if I ever encountered someone with this birthmark," she remarked, raising her delicate wrist once more, "I ought to inform him, as it could indicate that he is my father." Edward took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling rapidly. Only one individual held the knowledge to share that with her. "Who is your mom?" he inquired, fully aware of what the response would be. The girl's lips came together for a brief moment before she uttered a word. Lillian Brooks. The name struck him with the force of a blow to the stomach. Though the years had passed in silence, the name lingered in his memory, etched forever in his mind. Lillian had once held a unique place in his heart, a person who embraced him even with all his imperfections. Yet he had turned his back, firmly believing that affection and kinship would merely hinder his progress. He had embraced ambition. Before him stood the embodiment of that decision's aftermath. Edward rose from his seat, his figure looming over the tiny child. His heart raced, yet his face betrayed nothing. "Where is your mother at this moment?" he inquired. The young woman averted her eyes. Her delicate fingers curled tightly around the napkin. "She passed away last month." Edward felt a constriction in his chest. Lillian had departed. Years had passed since he last laid eyes on her, and just as many since she had crossed his mind. And now he would never lay eyes on her again. The weight of it struck him with an intensity he hadn't anticipated. He let out a breath, finding his balance. He had to maintain his composure, not in this moment, not in this place. His focus shifted back to the girl, his daughter. "May I ask what your name is?" he inquired. She raised her eyes, her vivid blue orbs brimming with an indefinable emotion. "Emily," she murmured gently. The name resonated in his thoughts, both strange and known simultaneously. Edward surveyed the restaurant with a keen eye. The scene was beginning to attract attention. He preferred not to engage in this discussion in such a public setting, surrounded by the inquisitive gazes of onlookers. He cast a glance over his shoulder at Emily. "Join me," he urged, his tone resolute yet gentle. After a brief pause, she gave a nod of agreement. Edward gently rested his hand on her petite shoulder, steering her toward the exit. The business dinner had concluded. Everything in his life had just shifted. Edward guided Emily out of the restaurant, his thoughts swirling in a whirlwind. The valet presented the keys with a nod, and he swung open the door of his polished black car, gesturing for her to enter. She paused briefly before getting in, gripping the seatbelt with delicate fingers, uncertain of her next move. He eased into the driver's seat, his hands clasping the steering wheel firmly as he cast a quick look her way. She appeared diminutive in the expansive leather seat, her blue eyes flitting between him and the strange environment. "Where have you been staying?" he asked, pulling out onto the road. Emily adjusted her position in the chair. "In the company of Miss Karen. She lives next door to us. Afterward, she welcomed me in." Her voice faded, fingers clutching the edge of her dress. "Yet she mentioned that I can't remain indefinitely." Edward let out a sharp breath, his fingers tightening around the wheel. The thought of his daughter, his precious child, being entrusted to a neighbor following her mother's passing, sent a painful twist through his very core. Lillian ought to have confided in him. He ought to have been aware. He compelled himself to maintain a steady tone. "Did your mother ever bring me up before that?" Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. "She mentioned that you held significance and had a lot on your plate. She mentioned that you were living your own life." Edward tightened his jaw, a silent storm brewing within him. He could hear Lillian's voice, gently shaping the truth to ensure that Emily would not harbor resentment for a man she had never known. She ought to have shared that with him. He suppressed the irritation bubbling within him. "Did she ever explain why she kept you from me?" Emily gently shook her head, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. "No, she merely stated that you weren't prepared at that time." The impact of the words was more profound than he anticipated. He felt the urge to contest, to refute it, yet beneath the surface, he recognized the truth of the matter. 8 years prior, he would have been at a loss regarding how to handle a child. He had scarcely grasped the art of self-care back then as well, too engrossed in his profession to contemplate anything beyond it. Yet now, as he sat in the car with his daughter, everything seemed transformed. He cast another look in her direction. "Is there something you have on hand? Apparel? Playthings?" Emily gave a slight shake of her head. "Miss Karen prepared a compact bag, yet I neglected to take it with me." I wasn't sure if you would like me to join you. Her voice was soft, hesitant, and there was an unsettling quality in her words that made Edward's stomach knot. Certainly, he responded. I want you with me, he said, his voice more resolute than he had meant it to be. Emily's head shifted in his direction, her blue eyes sparkling with an enigmatic expression. He cleared his throat, attempting to dispel the strange heaviness that clung to his chest. Tomorrow we'll collect your belongings. This evening you will be by my side. She gave a slight nod, remaining silent. The remainder of the journey unfolded in quietude, yet it felt far from uneasy. Emily gazed out at the city lights streaming past her window, her delicate hands resting quietly in her lap. As they arrived at his residence, a stylish, contemporary mansion tucked away in the serene outskirts of the city, Emily's lips parted ever so slightly. Is this where you live? She inquired, her voice scarcely rising above a whisper. Edward cast his eyes upon the grand house, its meticulously tended lawns and lofty windows shimmering in the gentle light of the street lamps. He had never truly contemplated it prior, but indeed it was substantial, chilly, crafted for an individual who had never anticipated the presence of another in his domain. Indeed, he replied with a straightforward tone. Emily lingered in her gaze for a heartbeat longer before giving a slight nod. She remained silent about her feelings toward it. He exited the vehicle, making his way to her side to open the door for her. She emerged gradually, her eyes darting back and forth between him and the house. Come on, he urged, his hand resting gently on her back as he led her toward the front door. Upon entering, they were enveloped by the stillness of the home. The lofty ceilings and expansive area that typically felt familiar to him now appeared desolate. Emily moved cautiously, glancing around with a sense of disbelief, as though she were unsure of her place in this moment. This place is enormous, she finally remarked. Edward exhaled softly. I guess that's the case. She glanced over at him. Are you residing here by yourself? He paused for a moment before giving a slight nod. Absolutely. Emily observed him intently for a prolonged moment before shifting her gaze elsewhere. There's a certain stillness in the air. Edward felt an unsettling weight in his chest from her words, though he couldn't quite understand why. He waved his hand toward the staircase. Let me take you to your room. Emily trailed behind him up the stairs, her delicate footsteps whispering against the gleaming floors. He guided her to a guest room, one among many, although he had never truly occupied any of them. The room exuded a sense of cleanliness, with the bed perfectly arranged and the decor kept to a bare minimum. It served its purpose. Void. Emily lingered in the doorway, surveying her surroundings. It's pleasant, she remarked, yet her tone lacked any genuine feeling. In a moment of clarity, Edward became acutely aware of his lack of preparation for this situation. The room existed merely as an empty space. It was devoid of toys, lacking stuffed animals, and absent of warmth. Nothing that truly belonged to her. We'll get you things tomorrow, he murmured, his words directed more inwardly than toward her. Emily nodded, but then paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. May I pose a question to you? Edward shifted his gaze towards her. Absolutely. She gazed up at him, her cerulean eyes filled with gravity. Will you hold on to me? His stomach tightened. Keep you? He repeated, caught off guard by the wording. Emily adjusted her stance. Miss Karen expressed uncertainty about my future destination. She mentioned that you might hesitate to accept me since I wasn't on your radar before. Edward took a deep breath, stifling the surge of feelings that overwhelmed him. He spoke with caution, revealing, I wasn't aware of you before. However, at this moment I have come to understand. He lowered himself a bit to meet her gaze. Emily, you're staying right here. She gripped the hem of her dress with a subtle intensity. Is that a guarantee? He maintained her gaze.
Yes, sur you.
For the first time since departing the restaurant, Emily's posture eased a bit. She nodded, releasing a soft exhale. Understood. Edward rose to his feet, observing her as she approached the bed and slipped beneath the covers. She appeared small in comparison to the expansive bed, yet there was no hint of fear in her demeanor. As he began to walk away, a faint voice called out to him once more before he could reach the door. "Sleep well, Dad." Edward stood still. His hold on the doorknob grew firmer. He dedicated his existence to constructing a realm devoid of emotions, a place where connections were mere hindrances. Yet, in just one night, everything transformed. He tilted his head ever so slightly, his voice softer than normal. "Sweet dreams, Emily." He turned off the light, closed the door, and for the first time in years, he understood that he was no longer alone. Edward hardly found rest that night. He had dedicated years to mastering every facet of his existence, his business, his image, his daily habits. Yet, everything seemed insignificant next to the reality that, just beyond the wall, his 8-year-old daughter lay sleeping in a bed that was not her own, in a house that had never been intended for a child. He lingered in his softly illuminated office, gazing at the city skyline through the expansive windows that reached from floor to ceiling. The glass mirrored his own demeanor, analytical, taut. Yet underneath there lies something unknown. Uncertainty. He was completely lost in his actions. For years, he convinced himself that feelings were vulnerabilities, that connections were mere diversions, that his craft was the sole priority. Yet, there was a young girl down the hall who had lost her mother, who had endured weeks of uncertainty, and who had asked him with a sincerity that pierced the heart, "Are you going to keep me?" Edward shut his eyes for a moment, massaging his temples gently. He was completely unaware of her existence. He ought to have been enraged with Lillian for keeping it from him, for robbing him of his decision. Yet, what troubled him even more was the contemplation of the struggles Emily must have faced following the loss of her mother, anticipating the moment when someone will come forward to take her as their own. Uncertainty lingered about whether anyone ever would. The thought of her feeling unwanted caused a tightness in his chest. In the quiet hours of the morning, fatigue finally took hold, and he succumbed to slumber in the chair. As he stirred from his slumber, the subtle rustle beyond his office door beckoned his attention. Edward propped himself up, his fingers brushing against his face as he glanced at his watch. It was almost 7 o'clock. He had slept in, a rare occurrence for him. He rose to his feet and made his way into the hallway, discovering Emily positioned by the staircase, gazing over the railing. She pivoted at the sound of his voice, her vivid blue eyes expanding just a touch. "I had no idea where to go," she confessed, adjusting her stance. "I hoped to let you rest undisturbed." Edward paused, grappling with the newness of sharing his space with another person. "You can wake me if you need to," he said, his voice gruffer than he meant to convey. Emily observed him intently for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Are you hungry?" he inquired after a moment of silence. She gave another nod. Edward found himself pondering why this idea hadn't crossed his mind sooner. He was accustomed to having his meals catered by staff or dining at his office. Yet today felt unique. "Let's go," he urged, gesturing toward the stairs. She trailed behind him silently as they navigated towards the kitchen. The area exuded a contemporary elegance, featuring polished stainless steel appliances and luxurious marble countertops. It resembled a showroom more than a space that had ever been inhabited. Emily ascended onto a bar stool at the island, her gaze fixed on him. "Are you familiar with the art of cooking?" Edward exhaled softly. "Not quite." Her lips were tightly sealed, a clear struggle against the urge to smile. "Mom excelled in that area." He halted by the fridge, casting a glance back at her over his shoulder. What did she prepare for breakfast? Emily's fingers danced across the counter, creating intricate patterns. "Pancakes, primarily," she remarked. They were simple. Edward swung the fridge door wide, his eyes darting across the shelves. He discovered eggs, milk, and a box of pancake mix. He was capable of achieving this. He had finalized billion-dollar agreements. He was adept at managing pancakes. He arranged the ingredients on the counter, glancing over to see Emily observing him with a hint of doubt in her eyes. "Excuse me?" he inquired. She merely shrugged her shoulders. It appears that pancakes may not be your preferred choice. Edward lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. How do I come across to others? Emily tilted her head, deep in thought. Like an individual who indulges in copious amounts of coffee and consumes meals from convenient packaging. Edward couldn't help but smirk, even against his better judgment. Close enough. He focused intently on the mixing bowl, striving to adhere to the instructions as accurately as possible. Emily propped her chin on her hands, visibly amused by his attempt. As he poured the batter into the pan, she leaned in just a bit. Be careful not to turn it too early, or it might fall apart. Do you possess expertise? She nodded with a grave expression. I observed my mother do it frequently. Edward cast a fleeting look in her direction. Then you must ensure that I get it correct. I won't let this slip through my fingers. Emily's blue eyes shimmered with an enigmatic spark. He was unaware of the significance until he noticed the subtle shift in her expression, a nearly undetectable relaxation of her tension. The initial pancake came out quite satisfactory. The latter was superior. He positioned the plate before Emily and gently set the syrup beside it. She grasped her fork, savored a bite, and chewed with contemplation. He inquired, arms crossed. They don't quite measure up to what Mom makes. Edward chuckled softly. Understood. Yet she pressed on, savoring another bite. They're quite decent. He regarded that as a victory. Their meal unfolded in a quietude that felt surprisingly at ease. For the first time since their encounter, Edward felt a sense of clarity, no longer adrift in uncertainty. Once Emily completed her meal, she placed her fork down and regarded him with a serious expression. What comes next? Edward released a breath, placing his coffee on the table. Now we unravel the complexities. Emily observed him intently for an extended period. Do you really want to proceed with that? Edward maintained his focus on her eyes. Absolutely. She appeared to ponder that for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Understood. One word, yet it held profound significance. For the first time, she was allowing herself to feel that she truly belonged in this place. Edward felt an unwavering certainty that he would not fail her. The morning following their inaugural breakfast, Edward discovered himself in uncharted territory. His existence had consistently been governed by structure, precision, and mastery. Yet, in that moment, an 8-year-old girl had entered his life, a daughter he had never known, completely transforming his reality in just a few short hours. Emily navigated the house with a careful demeanor, as though she questioned her right to be present in that space. She refrained from touching anything unless given explicit permission. She made no requests. She remained silent, keenly attentive, studying him as if she were attempting to discern the sincerity behind his words when he offered her a place to stay. Edward found himself at a loss, unsure of how to proceed with that revelation. He dedicated his life to navigating multimillion-dollar negotiations, managing intense situations, and making tough decisions within stringent timeframes. Yet this was unlike anything else. This was not a matter of business. This was genuine. By mid-morning, he came to the unsettling realization that they faced yet another dilemma. Emily found herself without any clothes, nothing to carry, nothing that truly belonged to her in this house. After many years, Edward stepped into a department store for the first time. Emily stood beside him, her delicate fingers clutching the strap of her bag, as she gazed up at the towering shelves filled with clothes, shoes, and accessories. The experience was utterly consuming. Choose anything you wish, Edward remarked, maintaining a steady tone. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. Everything? Absolutely. She nibbled on her lip, glancing around once more. Edward noticed the uncertainty reflected in her gaze, the subtle movement of her feet suggesting a lingering doubt in his words. I don't require much, she finally stated. One must possess sufficient, Edward countered. We won't be departing with merely a single ensemble. With a subtle nod, Emily began her slow descent down the aisle. She stood out from the usual children he had encountered in stores. There was a distinct lack of thrill, no hurried movements from one shelf to another, no spontaneous snatching of items. She exercised caution, reflective. She selected a handful of items, examined them intently, then returned the majority to their original place. In the end, she chose a few pairs of jeans, several shirts, a jacket, and a pair of sneakers. Edward scowled. Is that all there is? Emily gave a slight nod. He let out a deep breath. We'll obtain additional information later. She gazed at him, her expression a mystery that offered no clues. What is the reason behind this? Because you require certain things, Emily, he stated plainly. She observed him intently for a prolonged moment, then gave a slight nod once more. Understood. Upon completing their shopping, they made a stop at a bookstore. Emily strolled through the aisles with newfound assurance, her fingers gliding over the spines of the books. Edward patiently observed her, allowing her the space to thoughtfully select 3. He arched an eyebrow as she presented them to him. Just 3? She gave a slight shrug. Literature endures through the ages. Edward let out a breath, gently shaking his head. We'll return once you've completed these. For the first time that day, a smile graced Emily's face. Agreed. The journey back was serene, yet it held no sense of discomfort. She occupied the passenger seat, leafing through one of her books, stealing glances at him as if words were on the tip of her tongue, yet uncertain whether to voice them. Upon returning to the house, she brought the shopping bags inside, arranging them neatly by the staircase. There's no need for that, Edward remarked. I employ a team. I don't mind, Emily interjected. She paused, contemplating her next words. My mother always emphasized the importance of looking after your own belongings. Edward felt an unexpected weight from that, one that caught him off guard. He gave a slight nod. She was likely correct. Emily offered him a brief smile before picking up her bags and making her way upstairs to her room. Edward observed her departure, letting out a slow breath. He had never viewed himself as a parent. He never imagined he would become a parent, never anticipated pondering matters like education, literature, or the number of outfits required for an 8-year-old. Yet here he was, in his own home, observing his daughter adapt to a space that was never intended for a child, and in that moment, he came to a profound realization. This went beyond merely permitting her to remain. This was about ensuring she always felt a sense of belonging. For the first time in his life, Edward realized that certain matters held greater significance than mere business. One of them was family. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was distinctly altered. There was a nuance, a delicate change in the atmosphere, as if the quiet had lightened just a touch. Edward found himself unfamiliar with this sensation. His residence had consistently been precisely that, his own. Every aspect had been crafted for optimal performance and ease, yet lacked a sense of coziness. At that moment, a child was present upstairs, a young one who belonged to him. In that moment, the walls appeared to lose their intimidating presence. He sat in his office, striving to make sense of his workload, yet the figures on the screen seemed to meld into a haze. His thoughts wandered back to Emily. Was she finding her place? Did she sense a feeling of being out of place? Was there anything she required? What troubled him the most was his lack of knowledge. After several minutes of attempting, and failing, to concentrate, he pushed his chair back and stepped into the hallway. He lingered outside her door, caught in a moment of indecision, torn between the urge to knock and the impulse to retreat. Just as he was about to make a choice, the door let out a soft creak as it opened a fraction. Emily remained poised, her gaze directed upward toward him. She had opted for a different look, donning a slightly oversized t-shirt that likely belonged to her mother instead of the clothes she had chosen earlier. She cradled one of her new books in her hands, her fingers delicately tracing the edges. "Greetings," she remarked. Edward cleared his throat, a subtle prelude to the words he was about to share. "Hello." She adjusted her stance. "I plan to indulge in some reading before drifting off to sleep." He gave a slight nod. "That's quite pleasing." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "My mother would occasionally read to me." The phrases lingered in the space that separated them. Edward sensed their heaviness, the silent inquiry lurking beneath. He found himself saying, almost without thinking, that he could read to you. Emily appeared taken aback, as though she hadn't anticipated his proposal. After a prolonged gaze, she finally gave a nod of understanding. Understood. She made her way back to the bed, ascending onto it and drawing the blankets snugly over her legs. Edward took a seat in the chair next to her bed. With a gentle gesture, she presented the book to him, her azure gaze fixed intently as he began to turn the pages. He cast a fleeting look at the title. It was a book for children, yet one that carries a profound message, touching on bravery and the journey of returning to one's roots. He began to read, his voice unwavering, even as uncertainty lingered about whether he was performing it correctly. Emily remained silent. She simply absorbed the words. As he arrived at the chapter, her eyelids began to flutter with fatigue. She battled against the heaviness, striving to remain conscious, but ultimately, her breaths grew steady, and the book fell from her grasp. Edward lingered in silence, observing her peaceful slumber. She appeared serene, yet a faint furrow lingered on her brow, as if she feared that upon waking, everything might vanish once more. A tightness gripped his chest. He gently placed the book on the nightstand, then rose, carefully draping the blanket over her shoulders before stepping away. He paused for a moment, then, almost instinctively, extended his hand to gently sweep a loose strand of blonde hair away from her forehead. She remained completely still. He took a step back, casting a final glance her way before extinguishing the light and exiting the room. As he shut the door, a profound understanding washed over him. This was more than merely providing her with shelter. A place to call her own was essential for her. A household. For the first time, Edward realized he was not merely looking after a child. He was her dad. The following morning, Edward rose earlier than he typically did. His internal clock was honed for productivity, for the early hours and late evenings devoted to his craft. Yet today, an unusual sensation lingered in the air. He took his time, not hurrying to check his emails or get ready for a conference call. Instead, his thoughts drifted immediately to the little girl peacefully slumbering in the adjacent room. His offspring. The words still seemed unfamiliar to him, yet they felt slightly more familiar than they had the previous day. He emerged from his bedroom, lingering at Emily's door. The door stood a fraction open, allowing faint sounds of shuffling to drift out from within. He tapped gently. "Come in," a small voice called, belonging to Emily. Edward opened the door and discovered her on the floor, meticulously folding the new clothes they had purchased the day before. She meticulously arranged them into tidy stacks on the bed. "There's no need for that," he remarked. "There is someone available to handle the laundry." Emily gave a nonchalant shrug. "I'm perfectly fine with that." She pressed the fabric of the shirt, her delicate fingers moving with precision, as if this modest chore provided her with a feeling of mastery. Edward rested casually against the doorway. "Did you have a restful night?" Emily gave a slight nod. "Indeed." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Thank you for taking the time to listen to me." A subtle tension gripped his chest at the genuine warmth in her voice. "No problem at all," he replied. "If you'd like, I can certainly do it again tonight." Emily glanced up at him, her blue eyes growing wider, a hint of surprise flickering across her face at the unexpected proposal. She offered a slight nod. "Understood." Edward observed her for a brief moment before he cleared his throat. "It would be wise to have a bite to eat before we head out." Emily inclined her head. Where to go? Edward still hadn't shared the news with her. He was uncertain about her response. Yet, following the events of the previous night, he understood the course he needed to take. "We will collect the remaining items from Miss Cairns." Emily's eyes widened in astonishment. She took a moment to reflect, her thoughts swirling in the silence. Understood. The atmosphere was devoid of any thrill. There is no respite. It was a serene acknowledgement, as if she had conditioned herself to hold back her hopes. That felt off to him. "Prepare yourself," he instructed. "We will be departing shortly." With a slight nod, Emily returned to the task of folding her clothes. Edward pivoted and descended the stairs, mentally cataloging a crucial reminder for himself. This was more than simply retrieving her belongings. This was about ensuring she understood that it was her home as well. The journey to Miss Cairns' residence was serene. Emily occupied the passenger seat, her hands poised on her lap, fingers gently drumming against one another. Edward cast a quick look at her as they arrived at the unassuming two-story house. The atmosphere was cozy and welcoming, a setting where a child ought to feel secure. Miss Cairns awaited their arrival on the porch. She was a mature woman with gentle eyes and a weary smile. As soon as she laid eyes on Emily, her expression became gentle. "There's my girl," she said with affection. Emily stepped out of the car, pausing for a brief moment before making her way up the steps. Miss Cairns lowered herself and enveloped her in a tender embrace. Edward observed from a short distance, sensing his role as an outsider in a moment that felt beyond his reach to disrupt. Miss Cairns gently withdrew, tucking a loose strand of Emily's hair behind her ear with a tender touch. "How are you holding up, my dear?" Emily gave a slight nod. Indeed. She cast a fleeting look at Edward before redirecting her attention to Miss Cairns once more. "I believe that's the case." Miss Cairns offered a smile, her gaze lingering on Edward as she took a moment to observe him closely. "You must be her dad." It was not a question. Edward locked eyes with her, giving a subtle nod. "Indeed." Miss Cairns stood, her arms crossed firmly. "Lillian never mentioned it to you, did she?" Edward tightened his jaw, a subtle shake of his head following. "Negative." Miss Cairns let out a weary sigh. "I suspected that would be the case." She had the desire to. She came close time and again. She cast a fleeting look at Emily. Yet, fear gripped her. She believed you wouldn't have the desire to take on the role of a father. Edward let out a slow breath, casting a glance at Emily. She sat on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest, absorbing the sounds around her without a word. "She ought to have shared it with me," he murmured softly. Miss Cairns inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Absolutely. She ought to have." A pause lingered in the air before she finally broke the quiet. Emily has faced numerous challenges. She experienced the profound loss of her mother. She found herself without a place to call home. She's been putting on a brave face, but she's still just a young child. She hesitated. "She requires your assistance, Mr. Hale. More than you might think." Edward felt a heaviness in his chest as those words hung in the air. He acknowledged it. Miss Cairns regarded him once more, then offered a slight nod, as if reaching a conclusion. "Her belongings are within." I gathered all the items she had left behind. Emily rose to her feet. "I can understand it." Edward advanced with purpose. "We'll both achieve it." Emily blinked in astonishment but chose not to contest it. Within, the aroma of warm spices enveloped the space, creating an atmosphere where memories lingered in every nook. Edward observed the framed pictures adorning the walls. Some belonged to Miss Cairns' family, while a handful featured Emily too. She was cherished in this place. They took out the small bag of belongings, which was minimal. Just some clothes, a couple of stuffed animals, and a framed photo of her mother. Once all the belongings were stowed away in the car, Miss Cairns knelt before Emily once more. "You have my digits, darling. Feel free to reach out to me whenever you need, all right?" Emily nodded, her demeanor composed. Yet Edward noticed the subtle tension in her hands as they clenched ever so slightly. She restrained her feelings, much like he frequently did. Miss Cairns offered a soft smile. "Make sure to look after yourself." Emily took a deep breath, then embraced Miss Cairns in a swift yet firm hug. Edward averted his gaze, allowing them a brief pause. As Emily settled into the car, she exhaled softly, her gaze fixed on the world outside the window. The return journey was even more silent than it had been previously. Edward hesitated, unsure whether to break the silence, but eventually, it was Emily who found the words first. "She tended to my needs with great care," she murmured gently. Edward acknowledged with a nod, his gaze fixed firmly ahead on the road. "I can perceive." Stillness. After a lengthy silence, Emily finally faced him. Will you also look after me well? Edward experienced that question as if it were a blow to the heart. He looked at her, noticing how she attempted to appear nonchalant, yet the hesitation in her voice betrayed her true feelings. Indeed, he affirmed, his voice steady and unwavering. I shall. Emily maintained his gaze for just a heartbeat longer before giving a subtle nod. She remained silent, yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a hint of relaxation that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Edward understood that perhaps she was beginning to accept it. That night, Edward experienced an unprecedented moment, strolling past his office without pausing. His laptop remained idle on the desk, while his inbox brimmed with unread emails. Still, everything seemed to lack a sense of immediacy. His attention was directed to other matters. Emily sat in her room, carefully unpacking the small bag of belongings she had brought from Miss Karen's. She had remained silent since their return, though not in the same manner as before. This silence was not born from doubt. It was the quiet of an individual grappling with the complexities of an unfamiliar existence. Edward paused for a moment outside her door, his hand hovering before he rapped gently on the wood. Step inside, Emily invited. He entered, surveying his surroundings with a keen eye. The guest room remained devoid of a child's essence. It exuded a sense of refinement that felt distant and uninviting. Emily had thoughtfully arranged her stuffed animals on the bed and positioned the framed photo of her mother on the nightstand. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a book sprawled open before her, yet her gaze wandered elsewhere, far from the pages. Are you getting comfortable? Edward inquired. Emily gave a slight shrug. I suppose. He rested against the doorframe. I was considering that perhaps we could pick up a few items for your room tomorrow. Transform it into something uniquely yours. Emily glanced upward, her azure eyes brimming with a sense of uncertainty. What do you mean? I'm not sure, he confessed. Anything you desire. A workspace, fresh linens, perhaps a few prints. Emily bit her lip thoughtfully. I've never experienced having my own room before. Edward scowled. Did you tell your mom? She gave a slight nod. Though it was modest in size, it possessed a certain charm. He surveyed the stark, expansive room once more, a space crafted for visitors who would never truly arrive. This one belongs to you now, so it's time to embrace that feeling. Emily observed him intently for a moment, then gave a nod of understanding. Understood. Edward let out a breath. Excellent. She paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. Could we obtain some paint? He lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. Are you considering painting the walls? She gave a slight nod. My mom allowed me to choose the color in our previous home. Edward had never paused to consider the hue of his walls. They exuded a sense of calm, subtlety, and were meticulously selected by a skilled designer. Yet, at this moment, he understood for the first time that his choices were inconsequential. Which hue? He inquired. Emily inclined her head, pondering. Azure. Edward wore a subtle smirk. Statistics. Emily's lips quirked, as if she were stifling a grin. They lingered in quietude for a brief moment before she broke the stillness with her words once more. Will you still be reading to me tonight? Edward blinked, his eyes momentarily wide with surprise. He had made the offer once, yet he never anticipated it would turn into a routine. As he gazed at her, anticipation hanging in the air, he came to the surprising conclusion that he didn't mind at all. Indeed, he remarked, select a book. Emily nodded and picked up the one she had been holding earlier, climbing onto her bed with a sense of purpose. Edward settled into the chair next to her, turning to the page she had indicated. He read with a calm voice, and as the words enveloped the space, Emily's demeanor relaxed. As he delved into the second chapter, she started to blink more slowly, her breathing becoming steadier. Edward shut the book, lingering in the moment before making his next move. He observed her slumber, noting how her delicate hands lay gently on the blanket, and how the framed picture of her mother stood guard beside her, offering a silent comfort. For an extended period, he believed his existence was complete, marked by his achievements, his influence, and the meticulously managed environment he had created. It had reached its limit. As he sat there, observing his daughter in peaceful slumber, a new realization dawned on him. His life had been rather empty. It had been poised for existence. At long last, it came to be. This narrative goes beyond a wealthy man's revelation of fatherhood. The narrative delves into themes of atonement, accountability, and the surprising paths through which life compels us to face our histories. Edward Hale starts off as a man who thinks he possesses it all. He possesses influence, affluence, and dominion over his realm. Yet, in truth, he finds himself in solitude, his existence meticulously arranged to steer clear of emotional connections. As Emily steps into the scene, the very fabric of his self-perception starts to fray. The strength of this narrative lies not only in Edward's discovery of his daughter, but also in his slow evolution into a father figure. Transformation doesn't happen in an instant. Uncertainties, errors, and instances of indecision abound. Yet, as time goes on, his choice remains Emily. Not from a sense of duty, yet it is driven by his own desire. Emily, in contrast, is a young soul who has endured significant loss. She treads carefully, unsure if she can trust that Edward will remain. Her modest desires are few, yet it is her subtle hope that infuses the narrative with profound emotional resonance. She doesn't require an ideal father. She simply requires a presence that will remain steadfast. The elegance of the conclusion lies in its straightforwardness, with Edward reading to her under the night sky, assisting her in selecting items for her room, and assuring her that she has found her home. These subtle instances reveal that affection transcends extravagant displays. It's all about maintaining a steady rhythm, on the importance of presence. In the end, this tale revolves around the theme of second chances, illustrating how life can unexpectedly present you with something that turns out to be precisely what you needed all along. Edward discovered more than just his daughter. He discovered the elusive fragment of his existence. For the first time, he genuinely grasps the essence of wealth.